right. Part 3 and ready to wrap it up for our conclusion. So let me get the slides up and rolling. Let's talk about Texas and the Lone Star Rebellion. Let me remind you that Florida, of course, in 1819 with the famous Adams-Onis Treaty, or Florida Purchase Treaty, which is recorded as 1819, but some will tell you 1821 if you want to get picky, because that's when it goes into effect. And we promised never to take Texas in this treaty. We essentially got rid of it. But then Americans start slowly moving to, you guessed it, Texas. That's right. By 1823, about 300 families. By 1835, 30,000 families have moved to Texas, right? And who were these people going to Texas? They were known as the energetic, prolific, the religious, and then you've got your famous GTT, gone to Texas, right? If somebody was arrested or there was a warrant for their arrest for a crime, or they were in debt, they would just disappear and they would scrawl GTT on their door, gone to Texas, so their family would know that they were off. So there was an idea of the criminal element, the religious element, and also the energetic, exploring kind of frontiersman element. And it's really important to point out that when Americans went to Texas, there were certain rules and regulations, right? The Mexicans, or the Spanish at first, and then the Mexicans, when they had their independence, they wanted more people to come because this was a remote part of the New Spain or the New Mexico colony. And they said, you can come here. And they gave a tax deduction, right? You had tax-free status, which is reminiscent of why people came to America in the first place. And then they had certain rules you had to follow. You had to swear allegiance to Mexico. They had to convert to Catholicism. That was required. And they abolished slavery. But here it is. It's like a small miniature version of the whole American independence, because what happened was Americans went to Texas. We agreed to follow the rules, and then we just didn't. And we were so remote in those areas of Texas from the capitals of what was Mexico and New Spain before that, that they didn't really enforce the rules, right? And they got away with having slavery and not really being Catholic and not really swearing their allegiance. We had the famous frontiersmen, right? This was the great epic period of the frontiersmen, Davy Crockett and Jim Bowie. With his, what they called Arkansas toothpick, the Bowie knife. Davy Crockett, on the left, you see the famous Disney image of him. On the right, you see an actual photograph, or portrait, more likely. He was quite the character, legendary hunter who killed 105 bears in one hunting season, dropped out of school after 6 months because of a girl he was interested in, but then she left him, and so he quit school. He ran for Congress. He was actually a congressman. He ran as a joke, stayed for 3 terms, strongly against Jackson. He was a friend to Native Americans, spoke several Native American languages, and then he moved to Texas and thought it'd be cool to hang out at a place called the Alamo, and that was kind of his end, but we'll get to that later. Let's talk about the rebellion, the Lone Star Rebellion, the revolutionary birth of the new Texas. You can see here on the map, the yellow is what we'll refer to as the Texas Republic. That's what the Mexicans considered to be the province of Texas. And in 1829, they started to really kind of worry about some of the developments, some of the changes that were going on, the growth in Americans who didn't seem to be following the rules. So they didn't pass any new rules. This is reminiscent of American history, right, of the American independence. But they said, we're going to enforce the rules. We're going to remind you that you have to forbid slavery and you have to be a Catholic. And right away, the Americans refused. And to make a long story short, in 1836, the province declares its independence under Sam Houston. This was 29 when the laws were tightened, right? Sam Houston, and he gets himself arrested at first, and then the war was on, right? And we have 2 famous moments in American history. The one that's quite famous, the Alamo, a massacre in which 6,000 Mexican soldiers take on 200 Americans. They'd actually been told by their commander to abandon it, but they decided to try to hold on to it. And after a 13-day siege, every one of them is killed. Same thing with the Goliad, another massacre in which 400 Americans are killed by thousands of Spanish soldiers. Long story short, Santa Anna, the leader of the Mexican army, overconfident, attacks at San Jacinto, and actually loses, and it would have just been a minor battle in the history of the war, except that the president of Mexico, was leading his troops. Santa Anna was there, and he gets captured. Attempted to escape dressed as a woman, but he was captured and forced under duress to give away Texas. And in 1837, Andrew Jackson proudly recognizes the independent nation of Texas. We weren't ready to have it as a state, although right away they applied to join the United States, but that's going to take at least 10 years or so and some interesting politics. We'll move on to that in just a moment. There's your Alamo, like I said, one of the famous episodes in American history. Remember the Alamo became one of the battle cries, as well as Remember the Goliad was up there with it. Let's get right, well, here's just to remind you of the map, and I'll also point out, and this will be a big issue shortly in history, the yellow is what the Mexicans had always considered to be the republic, or the province, of Texas. But the new Republic of Texas wanted to claim all that is green, and that goes even further north, all the way up into Canada. But we'll get into that issue when we come back to class. Let's dive right into our last election, the election of 1844. And this will be a very interesting campaign. We're going to see James K. Polk, known as a dark horse candidate because he was not the guy anybody thought would be running as the Democrat, with his guy Dallas as a vice president. And he'll be running against Henry Clay and Theodore Frelinghuysen of New Jersey as his vice president. And then we're going to see a very important third-party candidate, James Birney. Won't get a lot of votes running for the Liberty Party, and actually originally from Alabama, but he'll be forced to leave the area because originally a slave owner becomes the leader of the anti-slavery party. Let's look at James K. Polk for a moment. Let's talk about his candidacy. He was not the original guy picked by the Democrats. The Democrats had a hard time picking, in fact. There's a little cartoon called The Presidential Sweepstakes of 44. And you can see, if you look in the middle, that one face you might recognize on the horse is Martin Van Buren. Van Buren and a fellow that will later be president, Buchanan, and a general named Lewis Cass. All of these guys were the original choices of the Democrats. But after 8 or 9 rounds of the convention trying to nominate somebody, out of nowhere they pulled this guy, Polk, right? Here's your first 3, Buren, Cass, and Buchanan. They were much more popular choices, but in the end, of course, it goes to Polk. And at first people were like, who? Nobody knew this guy. He was a Democrat from Tennessee. He had a nickname, the Young Hickory. He was a huge fan of Andrew Jackson, considered himself to be the protege of Andrew Jackson. So Old Hickory, Young Hickory. And he is going to run, one of the slogans is the 54-40 or fight. The idea of we will not give up Oregon or Washington to the British. So the Polk campaign strategy is going to be a strong, expanding America kind of a campaign. But this is one of those historically confused moments, actually, because the whole 54-40 or fight will really come a little bit after the election. If somebody asked you, I would just attach this to the election, but really it was more about reoccupying Oregon. The whole Oregon dispute will become a big deal in the 1840s, but we'll actually not fight. And as you can see, we'll give up a lot of the Oregon country to the British in 1846, 2 years after this election. But just for now, keep in mind this idea of 54-40 or fight. There he is, Henry Clay. And his campaign was known with its kind of a week-old, hooray for Clay, or the long and complicated Polk slavery in Texas, or Clay, Union, and Liberty. Clay, with his vice president, Frelinghuysen, here's their little campaign slogan, protective tariff, no annexation. Here's his biggest mistake. Clay is going to come in on the we don't want Texas side of things. And that was not popular, right? The American people wanted Texas. There was a real desire for an expanding America. And in fact, it turns out Clay was personally in favor of annexation. Right? And the South definitely wanted to annex because they wanted more Southern territory, more slavery. But Clay was trying to play the politician, and he knew that the Northerners, a lot of them were against taking Texas because that would mean one more slave territory and increase the idea of tensions between the free states and the slave states. So he waffled. He couldn't decide. He went back and forth on the whole thing. The Texas question, right? And so you see a lot of cartoons at the time of the election. What are we supposed to do about Texas? What should be the stance on Texas. Of course, the Liberty Party strongly opposed annexation, and Clay waffled. He tried to avoid it. He couldn't come up with a straight answer. Here's a cartoon that was attacking the Polk folks, though, for wanting to go get Texas, right? It says, going to Texas, GTT. Remember that whole idea of a kind of a criminal element going to Texas. And you've got this image. What do we got here? We've got Polk and Dallas getting ready to ride off with Andrew Jackson in front of them, and they've got their skull and crossbones free trade, right? Like death to the nation if we bring Texas in. And so there's that kind of an attitude. We also see another one with Andrew Jackson. He was a popular image in the election still, and he's dragging these candidates forward. Well, here's the results, right? It's going to go to Polk, the Democrat, against a very popular, very strong Congressman Clay, who's been around for a long time. When we see the electoral vote, 62%, 170 to 105, right? Doesn't seem all that close. But when you look at the popular vote, that 2% becomes kind of the spoiler role. For example, Bernie in New York, he gets 15,000 votes, and Polk is only going to win New York by about, if I remember correctly, by about 4,000 votes. So New York could have swung the other way, and a few other states could have swung the other way if you took the Liberty Party and the Bernie vote away. So it's a close election, but it's clearly in the Electoral College it goes to Polk, and of course Polk is going to see this as a mandate. There's that famous idea of the mandate of election, and since they talked so much about Texas and Polk was clear what he wanted to do with Texas, John Tyler, one of his last acts of president, will be to annex Texas and make it part of the United States in 1845. Polk enters into the presidency with 4 very clear goals that he had announced during his campaign. He was going to lower the tariff, that he was going to resolve the Oregon border boundary dispute, 54-40 or fight, that he was going to restore the idea of the independent treasury, and finally 4, that he would acquire California and perhaps the entire Southwest. We have one last cartoon here. Texas is coming in, right? And there's a realization that this is going to bring some new slavery issues into question as Texas enters, because it's a huge new territory. It's going to be a slave territory. It's going to mess up the balance between free states and slave states, and we're going to save that for later. And so that's the end of our lecture. Thank you very much, and we'll see you in school. Happy holidays, everybody, and take care. Bye.